everybody. My name is Mary Ellen Iatropoulos, and I am here with my colleague from the Carey Institute.
Hi, I'm India Futterman. I'm from the Carey Institute. I am the education program specialist over there. And thank you, Jewel, for inviting us to do a workshop today.
Yes, and thank you all for being here with us today. This is the story behind the data for The Light in the Lake. If you already happen to have a copy of The Light in the Lake, you can grab it. We're going to be reviewing an excerpt before we dive into things, but also you can just look at the excerpt. And we want to take a minute to thank the NEA Big Read and the Poughkeepsie Public Library District for bringing this amazing programming to the Hudson Valley. So before we get too far into the day, there are a couple of norms that we want to review, as is always the case with Zoom. There's going to be some things that are a little bit different than an in-person meeting. First, there is the formality of letting you all know that this session is being recorded. And that's so it will be available for future use. Jewel is going to be sending out a link in the chat box for a survey at the end of this. And then there will also be a link where all of the different presentations from all the professional developments across the Big Read will be stored for future use. India?
All right, and courtesies, please remember to mute your microphone unless you're speaking. We just want to reduce the amount of background noise, and please keep your video on so we know you're engaged, although we know you all will be, unless you're having technical difficulties or need to step away for a moment.
Please be patient with technology and with us. If some of us are in the middle of a sentence and all of a sudden we go, and then we don't continue talking, that probably means there's an internet glitch, which I think we are all especially sympathetic to after the hurricane a few days ago. Stick with us if there's technical difficulties. We are going to try to do the best we can with what we have.
Stay engaged, remain emotionally, intellectually, morally, and socially involved in the dialogue. And we'll try to foster a good conversation as well.
And finally, collaborative culture. Share ideas so that learning can happen and lessons can be made better. What we are going to be doing today is talking a bit about The Light in the Lake, talking about the role that data visualization and the scientific method play in The Light in the Lake, introducing a couple of fun, quick data visualization warm-up lessons to be used in elementary classrooms, and then offering you an opportunity to take a deeper dive into either the scientific method or artistic apps that can be used to generate infographics, or both. The major idea being that we're going to try to, go backwards a slide. The major idea being that we are going to try to show you many different ways that this book can be really fun, really engaging, and also present lessons at the intersection of literacy, science, and art. So for those of us who are not familiar with The Light in the Lake yet, it is about a 12-year-old young woman named Addie, and this is a very cursory synopsis that I threw together. 12-year-old Addie has a summer young scientist internship at the biological station on Maple Lake in Maine, where she lives. And as part of her work there, she travels around the lake. She's taking water samples, then she's inputting and measuring nitrate levels in the water samples, as well as marking on a big map everywhere that she encounters these harmful algal blooms on the lake surface. And doing this helps her visualize where on the lake the algal blooms are the most concentrated, which then leads her to discover that a dairy farm runoff might be altering the chemical composition of the lake water, which in turn, her findings spur her to become a community leader. She writes a letter to the editor of her local newspaper. She goes and she talks to some local dairy farmers. She walks the line between wanting the dairy farmers to not have the same sort of methods for getting rid of their biomass waste, but also being very sympathetic to dairy farmers because she comes from a long line of dairy farmers. And really, trying to use scientific truth to better her community while also understanding that it's hard for people to change sometimes, even in the face of scientific truth. And there's a lot more going on in this book than just these paragraphs could suggest. There's themes of grief and coming to terms with loss at the start of this book. She has just lost a twin brother who was fascinated by the lake, but really viewed the lake in terms of magic. He took very careful notes, but they weren't scientific notes so much as observations on what he thinks is a monster in the lake. She also has a best friend who's part of the 4-H club, and she's maybe the strongest pushback against wanting to change the ways of the dairy farmers. But really, the power of data visualization is at the heart of this book. And there is an excerpt that we're going to look at very quickly, and I'm just going to bring it up as a PDF. I wonder if we have anybody who just absolutely loves reading out loud. Can you give me a little one of these if anybody loves reading out loud? And if not, that's totally okay, because I happen to know a few librarians on this call who love reading out loud. Trina, thank you. Trina, could you please look at this excerpt for us and read the first 2 pages, and then I'll take the next ones, and maybe India, you take over from there, okay? Start here, please, with okay, he says, Trina.
All right. What? I just have to double check the page number. I'm just looking at my book.
Oh, that's right. It's page 94. It's the start of chapter 9. It's a few sentences down.
Okay. Sorry, my camera's not working. I don't know what's wrong, and I apologize about that.
Oh, that's okay. I also have a PDF for those of us who are able to see up on the screen here, which I hope it's clear enough.
Okay. Okay, he says. So Addie, we talked about earning some credit this summer that would allow you to join the science club early. In order to do that, you need to demonstrate that you can think like a scientist, and that means following certain steps. Like scientific method steps, I ask? Mr. Dale gives me a thumbs up. Care to summarize, he asks? I shrug. I'm a little rusty. I'm not, Tay says. You can thank my scientist mom for that. But I can condense it down for you, like way down. There's what, 6 steps? I can explain it in 3 words, guaranteed. I'm intrigued, says Mr. Dale. Okay, Tay says. Ready? Here they are. Wonder, learn, share. Wonder, learn, share, I repeat. Tay nods decisively. You got it. Mr. Dale laughs. Nice, he says. It kind of works, and it's so succinct. Perhaps I should be changing my curriculum. He gives us each a handout anyway, filled with the actual steps we have to follow. Make observations, ask questions, form and test a hypothesis, then analyze and communicate what we learned. I like Tay's version too. So what are we wondering, Mr. Dale asks? What do we need to learn? I straighten up in my seat. We're wondering if Maple Lake's polluted, I say. Or I mean, why it's polluted. I guess we've observed it is because of some of the harmful algae blooms. And we need to learn how bad the pollution is and where it's coming from, Tay says. Exactly, Mr. Dale says. Tay, from what I understand, your mother believes you are quite capable of participating in this project with Addie. Tay leans back and plunges an imaginary dagger into his heart. But then he pops up. I'm not big on science, Mr. D, he says, but I'll tag along with my buddy here. He holds clenched fingers in the air, and I bump mine back. As soon as our knuckles hit, I feel my throat catch and my eyes burn, just for a second. I look away, trying to forget the last time Amos and I fist bumped. You want me to keep going? I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think I'll jump in from here. It's always nice to have multiple voices. Thank you so much, Trina.
Sure.
Mr. Dale pulls out his laptop and shows us a spreadsheet. Here's a water sample log, he says. It's important because this is where we keep track of the nutrient levels we find in different parts of the lake. We'll be asking you and Tay to practice entering numbers every week, plus travel around the lake to help us take samples. Are we going to start that today? I ask. You bet, Mr. Dale says. But before that, I want to show you one of those harmful algal blooms Dr. Lee mentioned, so you know them when you see them. Blooms sound so pretty, like some kind of water flower. I picture pink and white lilies nestled on their green pads. But that word, harmful, reminds me it's probably not a flower at all. When Mr. Dale takes us outside and points at an almost slimy green spot in the water, I wrinkle my nose. I wouldn't describe these as blooms at all. Little chunks of near fluorescent green ripple with the waves. There aren't many, he says, not yet at least, but wherever they exist, we know the water quality isn't perfect. It looks pretty gross, honestly. Tay sticks his tongue out in a grimace. Yep, Mr. Dale says, but how it looks is the least of our worries. These harmful algal blooms can take over almost an entire lake. Did you know beaches elsewhere in the state have been shut down because of it? I can see why they shut down, Tay says. Who would want to swim in that stuff? Nobody, Mr. Dale says. It's bacteria, cyanobacteria. It's dangerous for people to be in water with harmful algal blooms like this because of the toxins that might be in there, not just in the air, but in the water too. I'm sorry, not just in the water, but in the air too. But that couldn't happen here. My words just blurred out, and as soon as I've said them, I know they sound foolish, especially for someone who wants to be a scientist. I lower my voice. I mean, how could it? I know it's hard to imagine, Addie, Mr. Dale says, but we need to determine what's causing this pollution if we want to keep it from spreading any further. All part of the learning step if we're going by Tay's method. And as we collect water samples, I'll be asking you to note on the map where you see harmful algal blooms. That will help us determine how far-reaching they are. In some parts of the lake, they might go away, but in the shallower areas, you'll see them more often. I look again at the patch of greenish-blue sludge, trying to remember if I've ever noticed anything like it before. I don't think I have. India, you want to take over the last of this page?
Sure, I'd love to. I'm engrossed. I love this story. But all of a sudden, I realize Amos did. This must be what he meant by green parts. He just didn't know what they technically were called or how they got there. Amos wondered. He tried to learn the best way he knew how, and he definitely wanted to share, first with me, and then, he said, once we were sure, with everybody. I feel something in my chest break open. I didn't help Amos. Mostly, I made fun of him for even thinking about a creature. His clues aren't very scientific, but he was following the scientific method. And the mystery he wanted to solve feels important. It's the job he never got to finish. Mr. Dale, Dr. Lee, Amos, they all see something in Maple Lake, something other people don't want to see. But that doesn't mean they'd agree. Dr. Lee and Mr. Dale might not see a magical creature, and Amos might not have seen that Maple Lake was polluted. I decide right then that my job will be to investigate it all. If I see any other evidence of pollution that could help the scientists, or any clues that remind me of Amos's, I'll keep track of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also, bravo! I just adore this book. It is simple and accessible, but also very engaging. It's very human, and there's a lot of real genuine emotion woven throughout all of the escapades that this young woman and her friend get into as they try and use science to better their community. And so as you can see, the power of data visualization plays a really huge role in the light in the lake. And so we realized this is a great opportunity for us to help you think of ways that you can teach the light in the lake alongside the scientific method and data visualization. So you might be thinking to yourself, I know what data visualization is, right? Yes, sort of, maybe. It's basically just the hands-on application of theory at the intersection of art, literary studies, and science. It is helping students use visuals to start to comprehend and then verbalize the meaning behind raw numbers, using things like infographics or pictures to be able to put into images what is represented by columns and spreadsheets and lots of data. It is a big debate in the art community over whether data visualization is art or not. Because, you know, there's a portion of artists who think that art exists for art's sake, and that if art exists for utility, specifically scientific function, that it somehow like denigrates or lessens the artistic quality. But there's also an equally loud group of artists who say, no, this is absolutely enacting the art standards because it's helping students connect and create and present and respond just in the way that art standards want them to, and also in the way that science and English standards want them to. But that's a lot of big words in there. And you might be thinking, okay, I'm an elementary school teacher. How young is too young to really understand data visually? In response to that question, we would say,
Never too young.
Never too young. Quick show of hands, who here has been to a 3-year-old's birthday party before? All right, does that 3-year-old know that they are 3 years old at their birthday party? Does a 4-year-old know that they are 4 years old at a birthday party? Does a 5-year-old know that they are 5 years old, etc.? If you have siblings, especially if a younger sibling doesn't have the right amount of candles on their cake, they'll tell you, hey, I'm supposed to have 7 candles on this cake because I'm 7 years old today. Here we have a perfect and a common, everyday, and very easily understood representation of data visually, right? The data here is the passage of years, and the way that we're representing it is by candles on a cake. So you can be young and still understand that an image or a picture represents something else. And that's really what data visualization is all about. It is taking meaning behind the numbers and it's trying to help you put it into pictures so that it's immediately at a glance accessible as to what the meaning behind the story is. So just a couple of quick thoughts again about being cheerleaders for why it's really important to teach data visualization to all ages. Numbers represent truths, whether that's the number of candles on a cake representing how many years old you are, whether that is the number of harmful algal blooms at a certain point in a lake that you're looking at, whether that is identifying, you know, you're going to be learning about zebra mussels and the density of phytoplankton in the Hudson River watershed later on. Every time you look at a data set, there are numbers representing truths in there, scientific measurements. But they're not just numbers for numbers' sake, right? Those numbers are telling a story. There's a relationship between those numbers, and that relationship can be examined and understood and used to better comprehend the world around us. The story that the numbers are telling has the power to change lives. And that's another plug for A Light in the Lake, why I think it's such a great book, because the story involves a young woman finding observations, drawing conclusions from those observations, finding a likely hypothesis as to what is causing the pollution, and being able to help people connect phenomena that is harmful to the lake with their actions and advocate for changing those actions. She even writes a letter to her community newspaper. It's a really cool model for, you know, civic action that young people can take. Birthday cake again. All right, so we have a couple of different, very quick warm-up activities that are the kind that you can just plug and play with your own students. This can be as an introduction to a larger unit on the scientific method. This can be just a fun icebreaker kind of thing where you can subtly slip in that you're practicing data visualization. I'm going to run through this as well as the other 2 quick lessons that we have for you before India takes us a little more in depth through the scientific method. But the first warm-up activity is a visualization of poll results. So you can ask your class an either or question. Here's an example. What do you prefer, hot dogs or hamburgers? And if there are 10 of us, say hypothetically 7 of us prefer hamburgers, 3 of us prefer hot dogs, the challenge for students would then be, how do you use pictures to represent the results of that poll? So let's say that a hot dog emoji equals 1 person who prefers hot dogs and a hamburger emoji equals 1 person who prefers hamburgers. Here's a data representation, a visualization of what our class looks like. We got a little hamburger pyramid on one side, got a much smaller hot dog pyramid on another side. And from there, you could ask students, okay, so what's a trend we could identify? Kind of seems like there are more people who prefer hamburgers than hot dogs, right? And this can work with anything. This can work on the day after the Super Bowl with favorite sports teams. This can work with, you know, what toppings do you like on pizza? This can work with who likes to go to the beach, who likes to go to the mountains. You can have students each come up with their own poll. That's a great way to authentically tap into their own interests. But the point behind this warm-up activity is just getting them to think about getting data on the class, finding out who prefers which category, and then how do I visually represent that data? If that felt a little quick, don't worry. If you go into the artistic apps breakout room, we're gonna go through what that could look like in your classroom in detail. But for right now, I'm gonna go on through to the next one. All right. Another warm-up activity, getting student minds prepped for data visualization, is the choropleth, which I love this word. It's a lot of fun to say, a lot of fun to whip out at parties, impress people. choropleth. It basically just means a map that uses color, specifically color gradients, to indicate meaning. So what this warm-up would entail is asking students to draw a map of their bedrooms or their apartments or their houses, or maybe just the kitchen. They can choose wherever they want to draw a map of. Then you ask them to choose a color and to think about, in that room, where physically do they spend the most time? And you lay tracing paper over the map, and you can use shapes, you can use shading in a color gradient. Basically just give students the challenge of using color to distinguish between where in this room or in this space do you spend the most time versus where do you spend less time. Now, for this example, we've set it up so that it's students thinking about their bedrooms or their houses, but you have probably seen a choropleth like this at some point in the last, God, how long have we been in this now? 5 months, 4 months? And you've probably seen it for other purposes besides just confirmed COVID cases as well. Choropleths are everywhere. They have them for voting statistics. They have them for places in the United States where people say soda versus where people say pop. Anytime you see a map that uses distinctions in the shading with a color, you're looking at a choropleth. And again, in a breakout room later, I'm going to show you how you can very simply just take a blank map of the United States, take a list of a ranking of states, and have students practice creating choropleths to help them wrap their mind around visual data. Like I said, we're tearing through just the ideas of these warm-up lessons. Oh, I just wanted to throw this in here because I thought it was beautiful and also a little terrifying. This is a choropleth that is illustrating how close McDonald's are to each other all across this great nation. And when you look at it, you can start to draw some conclusions of your own, right? For example, there seem to be a whole lot of them concentrated over here. And there seemed to be a little bit of a break out here where they're not quite so on top of each other. There are also, if you Google choropleth map United States, you will find literally hundreds. There are cell phone service coverage choropleths. There are concentrations of where indigenous tribes are still around and kicking despite how much they've been erased from popular American culture. There are maps for pretty much anything you can think of. You might have seen a choropleth map for people's favorite Halloween candy state by state. And then our very last quick warm-up activity is something that I like to, oh no, come back, sorry. I like to think of as the plot graph. This comes from Kurt Vonnegut's memoir, A Man Without a Country, where you take a book you've just read or a film you've just watched or your class text, and you ask for students to draw 2 lines. Ready? You're going to draw an x-axis, and that represents time, beginning to end, the start of the book or film to the end of the book or film. And you're going to draw a y-axis, where at the top it represents good fortune, at the bottom, ill fortune. Good stuff happening to bad stuff happening. And then you think through, okay, in terms of plot points, where does my protagonist start out at the start? Are things going good? Are things not going so good? This example right here, Vonnegut calls the boy meets girl story. I like to think of it as it could also be the boy meets boy story, or the individual meets an individual story, or the cat meets dog story, or basically one character meets and falls in love with another character, right? So as we start to go through the book, things are going great. There's a happy romantic comedy montage. They're prancing on a beach somewhere. And then something happens, and then things are terrible again. Fortunes are not faring well. Maybe somebody's moving away. Maybe somebody's parents don't approve. And after some sort of culminating conflict, things tend to start going back up again. I love thinking through movies that I've just seen in terms of a plot arc like this. And it's just like identifying trends in scientific data, which India will get to a little bit later. There's one that Vonnegut calls the Cinderella story, where you see things start out not so good, poor Cinderella, right? And then incrementally, something good happens and then it plateaus. Something good happens and then it plateaus. Something good and then it plateaus. And then the ball, hooray, the height of good fortune. And then midnight strikes and things go all the way back to terrible again. And then a little bit of time and then the shoe fits and then happily ever after. And after, and after, we see the little ad infinitum infinity symbol there. This one just makes me laugh. He calls this the Kafka. Things start out terrible, and then they get worse. Ooh. But turning something that is as graspable as a plot, do things start off good or bad? Do they end up good or bad? It really helps students think through how a story in narrative form is really similar to the story being told by numbers in data form. There is some sort of trend there. You might be able to draw conclusions from examining and analyzing that trend. And to talk to you more about examining and analyzing trends and the scientific method at large, I turn it over to my friend and colleague from the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, India Futterman. Go for it.
Mary Ellen, thank you. What an excellent introduction to data visualization, and I love those ideas for implementing it in the classroom. And it is always a struggle sometimes to connect kids and young learners to data. You know, I've had to go into many middle school classrooms in my career at Carey and try to get students jazzed about data, and it takes creativity. And so I think this is a great way of thinking about, yeah, how we can translate numbers into something that is perhaps more easily engaged with by young people. So awesome. Thank you, Mary Ellen. So to reorient us a little bit in the context of Light in the Lake and in the context of science, I want to remind everyone about the steps of the scientific method. Now, if you look up scientific method steps online, there's no agreed upon, you know, discrete 6 or 7 steps. And we sort of looked at that in Light in the Lake as well, how Tay had his own definition, his 3-step, what was it, wonder, learn, and share. And then Wonder, Learn, Share, and then Mr. Dale introduces his 6-step method, if you will. So I'll go through sort of how I, as a scientist, a young scientist, approach the method and how I communicate it to people typically. So it starts with an observation. For instance, a harmful algal bloom in a lake. You're noticing something's happening, you don't know why. So you formulate a question about it. Now, Addie's initial question in the book was, why are these harmful algal blooms happening? And while that's a really interesting question, it's not really a testable question in terms of the scientific method. So the process of formulating what we call a good question is actually pretty subtle and interesting. We need to figure out how to ask a question that we can then try to answer with an experiment. And so that involves identifying variables. And often you'll find that a big question like, why are harmful algal blooms happening, has to be narrowed down pretty significantly in order to be answerable. So scientific studies almost always end up addressing kind of a teeny aspect of a much larger phenomenon. That's how science progresses. Scientists keep adding on their own little bits of one big phenomenon, and then we synthesize. But so your question is going to be a more narrow approach to a phenomenon that you observe happening. You identify your variables. In Addie's case, it's the nitrate levels, it's the algal density, other water chemistry factors. And when you identify these variables, these players in the drama that is a scientific phenomenon, you can then hypothesize, what are the different effects of one variable on another? Are they related? What is that relationship? Why is something happening? To answer the question, you collect data, of course. And so in Addie's case, that was spatial extent of harmful algal blooms. Almost always these data are quantitative, they're numbers, but sometimes data can also be qualitative. It can be observations. The color of the algae, for instance, the smell of the area. You can't really put a number to that, but still valuable data. Then you analyze your data. And that could be either statistical, it's often statistical methods, but it can also be simply putting your data onto a map and looking at spatial differences and drawing conclusions based on that, which of course leads us to our final step, is drawing conclusions about the data based on your prior knowledge, based on considering all sorts of factors contributing to your phenomenon that you're studying. And your conclusions are always going to be a little bit speculative, but the strength of your conclusion is very much tied to the strength of your data set and how you choose to analyze your data. So your final product in the scientific method, whether that's a report, whether that's an oral presentation, whether that is a trifold poster board for your science fair, is a science story. You're essentially telling the story of a phenomenon, so in which the variables can be considered like your characters almost. They have relationships with one another. They have certain tendencies. Certain variables have certain tendencies towards certain behaviors. And the data that you collect and how you choose to represent that data shows the plot of your story. Kind of like what Mary Ellen showed with our Kafka tale. You can, when you're plotting a variables change over time, that's much like a story plot. So if you click slide for me, please, Mary Ellen, I have a little pop-up. I want to say that the storytelling aspect of science is particularly amenable to ecology, which is what I do, where I work at Carey Institute. And because ecology, by definition, is really the biological study of the relationships between different living organisms and their environments. So we have not only different characters interacting with one another, but we have a whole setting in which this whole ecological story is taking place. And if we can look at it that way, it becomes a very powerful way to communicate scientific phenomenon. Next slide, please. So I want to, as an example, I want to share with you one of my favorite science ecology stories ever. And it's happening right in our backyards in the Hudson River, and it is crazy. So I'm really excited to tell you about it. It's very exciting. Zebra mussels. Zebra mussels were introduced to the Hudson River in the early 90s. They're a tiny, tiny mollusk. They're about the size of a dime, and they're native to the Caspian Sea region in Eurasia. How they got here is they were transported in the ballast waters of ships. And ballast water, as some of you probably know, it's water that ships take up and then release to modulate the weight of the ship on the water. So as you can imagine, a ship can load up a bunch of ballast water in one location, and with all that water, take in a bunch of aquatic organisms, like zebra mussels, for instance. Then the ship goes on its way, releases its water in the next location, emits all the other organisms. Oh, and Charisse, you just said that your kids learned about zebra mussels when you went to Norrie Point. That's awesome. Norrie Point is a great place to study zebra mussels, a great ecological center in Statsburg. And I remember when I went to Norrie Point, I saw so many zebra mussels encrusted on their old barges they have there. And so, where was I? I was in ballast waters, of course. So ballast waters dumped into the Hudson River. And lo and behold, the Hudson just happens to be the perfect environment for zebra mussels to thrive. Zebra mussels feed on this guy on the right, who looks big but is actually teeny, teeny, tiny. That's under a microscope. That's a phytoplankton. Zebra mussels eat phytoplanktons in enormous quantities. They almost filter the water. So what scientists noticed when zebra mussels really invaded the Hudson River is that the waters were much clearer than before. It's because zebra mussels are feeding on all of this matter that makes the water turbid and murky. And so as they feed on it continually, the waters change. Next slide, please, Mary Ellen. And so I just want to illustrate just how fast and precipitous the rise of zebra mussels were in the Hudson River. So in mid-1991 is when we first see zebra mussel populations in the Hudson River in Catskill. By the end of that year, you see it's the black dots represent zebra mussel sightings. By the end of 1991, they've already spread as far down as Newburgh and up past Hudson. And then by 1992, just a year later, they have dominated the Hudson River. And today we'll see even greater extent of zebra mussel invasion. It was really so rapid and so dramatic. And next slide, please, if you will.
I will.
Oh, thank you. And so that figure comes from an early study of zebra mussel dynamics and arrival and establishment in the Hudson River that was led by a Carey Institute scientist, Dr. David Strayer. And what the scientists did was they collected tons of data, not only on the density of zebra mussels or the number or biomass of zebra mussels per meter squared, but they also looked at the number of new zebra mussels, new baby zebra mussels being spawned every year. And what they found was very interesting. Even though we do see this definite shot up in zebra mussel populations, the story isn't as simple as that. They're not just going to, populations aren't just going to increase without end. What the scientists saw was that, okay, in 1992, we have a big spike. We have a ton of new baby, veliger is a fancy word for baby zebra mussel. We have a ton of new baby zebra mussels. They're being born. It's a boom. And then in the next year, even though there are still a ton of zebra mussels in the Hudson River, there are fewer babies being born, fewer new zebra mussels being introduced, and then even less so in the following year. So what's going on? Fewer, even though zebra mussel populations are increasing, new zebra mussels are not being born. And it turns out, and I'll read this excerpt from the paper in very scientific jargon, and then I'll translate it, but circumstantial evidence strongly suggests that the poor growth and recruitment of YOY, that means young of the year, or our baby zebra mussels, were caused by inadequate food supply. Filtration by zebra mussels reduced phytoplankton biomass in September 1992 through 94 to 10 to 20% of pre-invasion levels. Basically, what this is saying is that zebra mussels are growing so fast and in such high rates that they're depleting the environment of their own food source. They are eating all of the phytoplankton that's available to them. And so when these new babies are born, there's not enough food for them and they die. And so at some point, the zebra mussels are going to deplete and they're going to outcompete the other organisms, and they're totally going to decimate their own food supply. And next slide, please. And then as data were collected past the 90s and into the 2000s and up to 2014, we see an even more interesting picture. We see this huge increase in zebra mussels and then a precipitous decline, presumably as their food source is being depleted. But then there's a spike again in populations, and then it decreases again, and then another spike, and so on. So it's this cycle of zebra mussel populations increasing. They eat all the food, they all die. The phytoplankton have a chance to revitalize their populations when there's fewer zebra mussels. But then more phytoplankton equals more food for zebra mussels. Zebra mussel populations spike again, and thus the cycle continues. And if you just click slide, Mary Ellen, for me, I'll show you the graph I just showed you on the previous slide. Inset, we can see it here. This is just a little detail of what's happening. In 1992, we start with this huge spike in zebra mussels. Then the increase is at a smaller rate, a slower rate. By 1993, we see that reflected here. And then we have this plunge by 1994. And we can see that here. I realize you can't see my cursor, but Mary Ellen, you're doing a good job with your cursor. Thank you. By this 1994 on the smaller graph, that's reflected. You see there's this huge decline, and that's reflected in this expanded graph above. So really interesting dynamics, very tight relationship between phytoplanktons and zebra mussels. Next slide, please. Oh, do you want to add something?
Yes, just real quick to think through how a graph is also data visualization, right? If India gave you a big spreadsheet of different columns and different numbers, looking at it at a glance might not mean anything at all to you, but looking at a graph, you can see how the numbers spike and get a very accessible and immediate kind of picture that there is some dramatic changing happen. There's some drama going down in Zebra Mussel Town, basically.
Exactly. But I would add to that, if you could stay on that graph for just a second.
I sure can.
I want to add to that I sort of cushioned this graph with a lot of background information for you. I told you, the teachers, that the reason why these dips and spikes are happening is due to phytoplankton, but the graph doesn't actually say any of that. The graph simply shows two variables, time and populations. So it's up to the viewer to fill in with background information why exactly that's happening, and how and sort of what phenomenon this graph is actually showing. this, as Mary Ellen said, numbers are facts. We're simply presenting the facts, and how we interpret the graph introduces a certain level of subjectivity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to make that clear that the way that I explain this graph has a lot to do with what I know about zebra mussels and what you now know. So yeah, small disclaimer. Thanks. So I want to hear from you all as folks who have just heard the story of zebra mussels, although some of you have already experienced zebra mussels. What would we say are the quote unquote narrative elements of this story? If we were to tell the story of zebra mussels in an accessible way, who would we call the characters in the story, for instance? What's the setting? What's the plot? What happens in this story of zebra mussels in the Hudson River? What are the conflicts that happen between the characters? And what changes by the end? So who can tell me who they think sort of the characters in our story are? And you can just unmute. Are we good with that? Unmute and call out.
Yes, and I might call on people who I know here. Meredith, would you like to take a stab at answering? Who are the characters here?
I would say the phytoplankton and the zebra mussels.
Precisely.
And I just keep envisioning like a SpongeBob SquarePants episode of this whole story.
I gotta say, SpongeBob was a show that was in part created by marine biologists, so they knew a thing or two about data visualization. So, but thank you, Meredith. Exactly. And what would our setting be?
The Hudson River?
Exactly. Familiar old Hudson River. Our plot is what I showed on our graph. That's sort of our story plot. In this 20-year period, these cyclical increases and decreases, and I would say that the conflict ties in with the plot. The conflict is, of course, this constant struggle between, and I would say, not only zebra mussels and phytoplankton, but baby zebra mussels and adult zebra mussels too.
Yes.
There's a story within a story. It's complex, and again, I just want to reiterate that this is only one small facet of the huge tapestry of the Hudson River estuary ecology that involves water chemistry, it involves plants and fish. This is just one small microsystem in that larger ecosystem. Remember, I talked about this sort of simplification you have to do in studies. And
just a little quick note, also on the simplification tip, is that for younger learners, anthropomorphizing scientific elements can be very, very helpful. For example, we know that when a baby zebra mussel tries to feed itself, it might not be thinking, this time I'm gonna take the cycle upwards and I'm gonna be part of a spike in growth. And, even if they don't literally think that, it can be fun to sort of cast those emotions onto them as characters. So all of a sudden there's this epic struggle for domination between the phytoplankton and the zebra mussels. And there's these intermittent periods of prosperity and everything's great. And then the next year, utter famine. So that plot graph is going down.
Exactly.
Right. That's all. It can be fun to do that.
Yeah, and we'll also talk about that in just a few slides too. And actually, if you go to the next one, I want to talk about the different ways in which the story of zebra mussels has been told in different contexts. So there's lots of different ways to tell science stories. One of the most powerful is visuals, and especially in ecology, we're always looking at food webs and flow charts. And here's just like a nice simplified flow chart of zebra mussel feeding habits. This cycle of removing algae from the water column, depositing the waste, talking about how the waste from the zebra mussels interacts with water chemistry and how that in turn affects other organisms. So we have a simple flow chart. If you'll go to the next slide, Mary Ellen. We can get even less scientific and do much more of an engaging visual that's much more of, this draws on the is it art question. I think this is art. This is, I actually don't know the artist behind this, but this is I love this painting of zebra mussel takeover in the Hudson River estuary. Here's our Mid-Hudson Bridge and a bunch of native species. This, while not presenting the data per se, or the explicit dynamics, we see just how far just the extent of zebra mussel domination, how they attach to wood waste and other bivalves, and the different organisms that they affect. And this is, I think, a really engaging scene. This almost looks like a tableau or something, a scene of the Hudson River estuary. Next slide.
And can we just say that this guy's face down here kind of sums up everything you need to know about zebra mussel invasion?
Yep.
Look at this, is the face of a fish who is bound for extinction and just realized. Ooh. Again, anthropomorphizing.
Exactly. And speaking of anthropomorphizing, another way of science storytelling that Mary Ellen just touched on is literally storytelling verbally. And a lot of that has to do with anthropomorphizing your different characters when they are not human. And so I found this excellent New York Times article from a few years after zebra mussels were discovered and really came into the public light as a huge problem in the Hudson. And the Times describes it as an ecological melodrama. So I want to read this little dramatic, this is right from the beginning of the article. Silently, mostly out of sight and unknown to all but a handful of the millions of people who live along the Hudson River, a subtle but elegant ecological drama is underway that may determine whether the revitalized river can continue its hard-won recovery from decades of pollution and degradation. So I'll just interject that in this storytelling, the Hudson River is not only a setting, but the Hudson River is also a character that's interacting and responding to these different organisms. The central player in the drama, our character, thank you, Meredith, is the zebra mussel, a coin-sized, hard-shelled, black and white striped mollusk from Eurasia that hitchhiked to the Great Lakes aboard ocean-going ships in the late 1980s and has since been on the march in waters of the northeastern United States. The mussels first appeared in the Hudson a decade ago. Their fluctuating population there is estimated at 500 billion to 600 billion in peak years, which is unbelievable. And I bolded the sort of what I thought were the dramatic narrative elements of this piece. And also I wanted to point out how much I appreciated there were no photographs in this article. It was rather a short article, but this vivid description of what the mussels look like, they're kind of charismatic, and they're iconic also in how they look. And so that also lends itself well to this story. So I thought this was a great example of a dramatization of a scientific phenomenon. And if I go to the next slide.
Sorry.
Oh, I think the next slide is my favorite, I must say. So before we play this, I'm going to show you a quick 5-minute video. Part of my job is leading something called the Hudson Data Jam, which I've talked to many of you about. But if you don't know what it is a data visualization, data communication competition for high school and middle school students to look at local ecological data sets and then communicate trends that they find in a creative way. So I wanted to share a video that's a group of high school students from Ossining created about the zebra mussel invasion that really tells a great story. It's really funny, and I think it's very impressive. And Mary Ellen, I just, as a heads up, I think you probably know this, but I think you have to share your computer audio in order to play this video and have everybody else hear it. So that would be view options, I think. Up at the top. View
Up
options.
at the top.
Oh no.
More. Meeting info, head video panel, optimize screen share for video clip. Well, I'll tell you what, you tell me if you can hear this in just a minute. No, go back.
Ooh, I can hear it.
In a thriving aquatic ecosystem known as Ossining, life carried on as usual. Local primary consumers were able to consume their phytoplankton, dissolved oxygen was decent, turbidity was manageable, and everyone lived in harmony. until the zebra mussels arrived.
Good morning, class. Today we're going to begin our notes on the human ecosystem. But first, I would like to introduce our new student, Mr. Zebra Mussel. Mr. Unidid. Mr. Unidid. Mr. Unidid. I'd like you to take Mr. Mussel after class to adjust him to the new ecosystem. But do it!
Suck. Our school has, you know, the usual, like, phytoplankton, platycerans, zooplankton. Oh, and rotifers. I love rotifers. Yes. It's such a coincidence. I love rotifers, too.
Hey guys, it should really come down here. It's safe, they have plenty of food, work, and really need to clean up this turbidity. And they have rotifers!
Soon, Zebra Mussel's family and friends all settled in town. I lost them. This figure shows zebra mussel populations over the years, and as you can see, they show no signs of stopping. With this data, we're able to see the extent of the zebra mussel's damage. Correlational analysis was performed on data that dates back to the late 1980s. This data suggests that the presence of zebra mussels does in fact have an influence on the population size of copepods. Some data do not show significant change, like this water transparency data. This data was provided by the Care Institute of Ecosystem Studies. Thank you.
I hope you loved that. I really liked how they cast it in a high school. And so it was the zebra mussels establishment was likened to like a new student coming in. And these students sort of went a little deeper and looked at other data sets with specific organisms that the zebra mussels were out competing, like rotifers, like caudicerans, you know, all those little scientific terms that we heard. So this was one of our students that was out competed. You saw the zebra mussel eating all of his food. But yeah, that's one fun example of a data story being told in a literal drama. So thanks for watching. We'll go to the next slide. And then another really powerful way of visualizing and telling data stories in a succinct way is an infographic. Now, I love the Austin students video. I love the New York Times article. Both do require time and interpretation to sort of parse out the science and the story. But if you really want to introduce your audience to the full picture, to show them the data, show them how it's affecting their lives, but to do that, sorry, I was distracted by the chat real quick. But to do that in a succinct way, we can employ infographics which combine verbal storytelling, such like in the New York Times article that we looked at, visuals, which could be a food web, it could simply be images of our charismatic organism, the zebra mussel, or anything else, plus the data themselves. So we have this number, we have numbers, visuals, and verbals all coming together in one succinct package to produce an infographic. And Mary Ellen, I don't know if you have like a trade definition of what an infographic is that would maybe help sum that up. But the way that I see infographics are just, they're usually presented as a poster, and it is a single document meant to prove a point, illustrate a phenomenon, and employ several sources of data and several different information sources to produce a, sort of a concise science story and phenomenon. But Mary Ellen, if you had anything to add to that definition.
Sure. So at the Artifact where I work, we usually think of infographics as, in its simplest form, information in a graphic. Mm-hmm. A picture that represents information that is bigger than just the picture. And I want to show you two infographics that were created by students at the Artifact through a grant that we received from the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute that were about the Fallkill Creek, which we learned a lot with our teenagers during this grant. Mostly we learned that the psychological key to getting teenagers to really care about an issue is approaching it from the angle that something has been taken from them or that they are losing out on something because of previous generations, which teenagers, gotta love them, right? But out of all the different statistics that we reviewed about pollution in the Fallkill Creek, the one that really resonated with them was that there are 4 extinct species that used to populate the Fallkill Creek. Or I should say these species are not extinct from the earth, but they are extinct in the Fallkill Creek. They no longer inhabit the Fallkill Creek because of high levels of pollution. And those were called the dwarf wedge mussel, the bog turtle, the New England cottontail, and the Indiana bat. And there is information in very small font about what these endangered animals who are extinct from the creek used to be like when they were in the creek. I also think it's really neat how cute they made the animals to really tug at the heartstrings, right? It's like, we're not just missing out on bog turtles, but look at how cute the bog turtle is. So that's less tracking of data in an infographic, but more just getting the message across that these used to exist in the Fallkill Creek and now they're not. Over here, this one is maybe even less about synthesis of scientific data and is just visually representing different ways that people can join the Fallkill Creek. It's interesting how they chose very similar color schemes as well. They were dealing with ecological issues and they all automatically thought greens and blues, which I think is a pretty cool way to interpret it. All right, I'm gonna stop the screen share for just a sec because I would love to take the temperature of the room, so to speak. We had initially planned to do the following, to take a quick bio break right now and then to ask everybody if they would prefer to be in one of 2 different breakout rooms. One breakout room with India, where she is gonna go to the CARI website and show you where you can access data sets and then walk you through interpreting a data set to arrive at a hypothesis, make a graph, and get the info you need to create some data. Or to jump into a breakout room with me where I show you, oh, I see Cindy Ramsey, we are totally on the same page. There's a series of different free apps that you can use to create infographics. But I think since we have a full hour, we might want to do it as one big group instead of breaking into 2 different rooms.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, let's take a 2-minute bio break. If you need to stretch your legs, do your business, go get some coffee. And then when we come back, Indy, you are going to take us, you're going to do your own screen share, take us to where on the Carey Institute site we can access data. And then in the last 20 minutes or so, we'll go over to my iPad and show you all of the wonderful free online resources you can use on your own time or with students to create some data visualizations.
Yes, and for anyone who's interested in the Data Jam, Allie, I see you. That'll be this next session will be some more information about that and getting involved. And great, thanks for your interest. All right, so
thanks for sticking with us. All right, 2 minutes on the timer, maybe 2.5 minutes on the timer.
Generous.
And go. BRB, everybody. Yes.
I love you.
Alrighty, so everybody, I've put the names of some of the apps that we will be playing with later into the chat. That is just in case anybody who is interested is not able to stick around for the duration of our training until noon. But as a little bit of incentive for you to indeed stick around to the end of the training, when we get to the end, we are going to be giving a link to a feedback survey. And that feedback survey is what completes your participation and what generates the documentation that you attended this professional development that then gets sent to your district. And so India, here you are back again. You want to take it over?
I would love to take it over. Thanks, Mary Ellen. And thank you all, yes, for sticking with us. 2 hours is a marathon to talk about data, but I think we've made it pretty interesting. So I'm gonna,
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go and share my screen and show you how to navigate the Carey Institute website, so you can not only find the data set that I was just expounding on, but a whole score of others with just as interesting data stories, some even more complicated than the zebra mussel. So, careyinstitute.org, very simple. This is over in Millbrook. I think I mentioned that at the beginning of our session. Carey Institute's in Millbrook, and we are a nonprofit. If you're not familiar, we're a nonprofit research and education institution. So we have all these lab facilities at Carey Institute. We've got a bunch of forest ecologists and urban ecologists and aquatic ecologists looking at a whole bunch of different things. We also do a lot of research on ticks and Lyme disease. So you might have seen the Tick Project. Perhaps they visited your lawns to collect ticks and study them, but they're a wonderful volunteer, not volunteer-led, but sort of almost citizen science project that's being done through Carey. And where I work is in the education department. So we do education for kids as young as preschool, and up through high school. We have an REU program for college students, that's research experiences for undergrads. And this summer, I'm also working with a couple local high school teachers as a teacher fellowship program that we do over the summer. So we do a lot of different things, a lot of engagement, but enough on Carey and specifically to data, the data jam. So if I go under Eco Inquiry tab, oops, sorry about that. We have the data jam competition. And the data jam competition just ended this year. Well, it didn't just end, it ended back in mid-June. It was a little tricky this year because of obvious circumstances, you know, but we made it work and students submitted projects. This is that's still from that video we just watched. That's sort of one of our favorite data jam examples to show students. But what I'm going to direct you to is the sidebar data sets. And if you scroll down, here they all are. We have tons. So here's the zebra mussel data set, but we also have data sets on farming trends in New York State, something totally different, but still ecological. As Mary Ellen talked about, that's a huge part of Light in the Lake is this dairy farm runoff. And so that's actually sort of tied in with this data set. We've got water chemistry, salt levels in the Hudson. We have fish surveys of fish populations. There's also anthropogenic ecology data sets with air pollution and traffic. So there's a ton of different kinds of data we have. These are all these data sets are from real scientific studies done by both Carey Institute scientists, but also scientists working at the DEC, the USGS, all sorts of different agencies and institutions in the area. And it's all local data on the Hudson River, which is amazing. So our data sets are broken down into 3 levels, one being easy, but that really just denotes a rather simple data set with 1 or 2 variables, a clearly identifiable trend, and 3 being the most challenging. So there's no clear trend in the data. There's a lot of interpretation, advanced interpretation that needs to go into looking at these data sets. But our zebra mussel data set is one of our level 1s. And if we click on it, we're led to this page, which not only has the raw data, themselves, which is in a Google Sheet, but it also has a background sheet for background information, what we call metadata. And if you're not familiar with metadata, that simply refers to data about the data, hence the meta. So I think of metadata as the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who collected the data? What were they trying to answer? When it was collected, that's really important for context. Why it was collected and how it was collected. And especially when we're looking at the how and the who of the data, that can help us parse out, for instance, what certain biases may have been introduced in data collection, for example. And this is sort of what I was talking about when we were looking at just our graph of zebra mussel populations over time, how the graph itself definitely shows some relationship and some kind of trend, but without all of this background information, it's somewhat hard to interpret and explain exactly what's happening. So that's where these background sheets come in. We have some information about the natural history of zebra mussels, where they fit in our food web. Here are some examples of more phytoplankton that they consume. And then the background sheet also breaks the data into distinct variables and defines units. Units are also an extremely important thing to familiarize yourself with when you're working with the data set. What quantities are we looking at? What actually are we looking at when we say zebra mussel population? Is that number of zebra mussels? Actually, no. What we're looking at is their density, so number per meters squared. Again, how the data were collected, information about where they were collected, and then the source of the data if for whatever reason you want to go back to the original study. So almost all of the data sets on the Carey Institute website have these expanded background sheets that can help guide in the data analysis. And so again, this is just one of them. We have a ton of others. And something else that I wanted to show you is this Hudson Valley data portal. So this leads us to a really cool tool that's open source, available to anyone, where this is called Tuva, and this is an interactive graphing tool. All of the Carey data sets are uploaded onto this portal, is what we call it. So let me go and find the zebra mussel data set. So this is something that's really helpful if you're not used to working in Google Sheets or Excel in making graphs. And so, let's see. All of our variables for the zebra mussel data set, so not only zebra mussel population, but also the other organisms that they consume, phytoplankton, rotifers, all of the variables are listed on the left side, and we can drag and drop variables onto our graph to graph them instantaneously. So let's say I want to graph zebra mussel populations over time, which is the graph we were looking at before. I'll drag my year variable into the x-axis, because that's typically how we show time series data. It makes sense, linear time scale, easy to interpret. And then zebra mussel density will be on my y-axis. Drag and drop. We'll make this a line chart rather than a dot plot, so we can really see change over time. And there you have it. We have this beautiful graph, which is the exact same one that I showed you in our slides, that we made in a matter of seconds without any futzing with numbers and Google Sheets, which, to be honest, can be really tricky to work with and not amenable to younger students. So Tuva is a really fabulous and user-friendly way to visualize data. And you'll see that there are all these different options for different types of graphs that you can make. Some graph types are not useful for certain data sets. For instance, there's not really any use for us to make a pie chart because we're not looking at parts of a whole, we're looking at change over time. So therefore, a line graph or a dot plot would be most useful. But depending on the data set you're looking at, you can do all sorts of different types of graphing. And again, this is something that you can find on the Carey Institute website in the Hudson Data Jam page under data sets. And I'll share, maybe I'll compile a list of links and share with folks. for all of these different links, because you can, unfortunately, there's some digging you have to do on the website. But I'll make sure you all have these links because it's a great resource. And then if you are interested in looking at past Data Jam submissions, so other ways in which middle and high school students have chosen to interpret and present data, we can go into Project Gallery. And Data Jam's been going on for the past 7 years. And we've had so many incredible project submissions. It's not just videos. We have all art forms. We have dance pieces, visual art, sculptures, which are visual art, of course. We have video games that have been made, short stories, children's books. So this is the year that I oversaw 2020. And we've just had some incredible, we had some incredible videos. This was a beautiful children's book that was made. One of our most popular data sets to use is the dates of spring bird arrivals in the Hudson Valley. So birds migrate, of course, to warmer weather in the winter and then return to this area as it gets warmer. But as the climate continues to warm, that first warm day of the year when birds arrive becomes earlier and earlier in the year. And so that's a trend that we see in the data. So this student did this beautiful illustrated children's book talking about that phenomenon, and again anthropomorphizes these birds, Billy and Maggie the magpie, all of these native birds, and tells their story about their arrival. We had a Jeopardy game that was filmed, which was a great way for students to like very explicitly share data trends and facts. I thought it was a really clever way for them to communicate data while still making it fun. And this was a zebra mussel project. We often have three-dimensional graphs, like interactive visualizations that aren't just flat on a screen, but are instead sort of tactile. So these students chose to do sort of a spatial graph, a map with individual little graphs stemming from it. We just have, you know, like I showed before, illustrations, artistic illustrations of phenomena. These are some fish falling prey to PCB pollution in the Hudson River. I love this one. This was our top prize for high school. And then we had another really great video about pharmaceuticals in the Hudson. And then this student did an incredible data visualization where she was showing, this is a sixth grader. She did such a great job. Where she was trying to make a tool to show which local animals were present at which times of day at the Carey Institute. And these were detected on wildlife cams that we have set up. That's where that data set comes from. And so Lulu was like, I'm gonna make something where you can spin a wheel that tells you how many of each organism was seen during sunrise, dusk, and at nighttime. And so, for instance, this deer, so X amount was seen, of deers were seen at the nighttime, and then this is number at twilight or dusk, and this is during the day. So, and as you spin the wheel, you get the data for all the different organisms. So this was another fascinating data visualization. So kids do a ton of amazing stuff. They want to understand data, and so they'll present it in the way that they understand it, and often it works really well. So that's sort of my involvement with data and data visualization, and it's what I teach, and so I think about it all the time. And so it's really great to have a book like this, like Light in the Lake, that is so, it's such a nice natural bridge between the science and the storytelling. And Mary Ellen, do you think that suffices for walking through data? I mean, I can do some more if, yeah.
Well, I think that suffices for now. I think looking at what time we have, we're probably going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes looking at a couple of different apps. And then I think we will have another 20 minutes for questions, for more guided tutorials.
Yep.
If people want to cut out a little bit early, I think that would be okay also.
Yeah.
So what we are going to do now is, if you have wondered who the name Fresco refers to in the chat, that is actually my trusty iPad that I am booting up right now. And while I'm doing that, does anybody have any questions for India? No? All right. Then
Oh, I see a hand from Maxine. Hi.
Hi, I just have a question. I love this data set availability online. Do you know of other ones that are available like throughout the country, so that like if kids lived in California, like that there was a data set that related to someplace closer to their home? Like, do you know other ones like that?
Not offhand, but for the most part, a lot of data sets are especially from state agencies, are just readily available online. Sometimes they'll require a little bit of digging. Like, I don't think that a middle school student would necessarily be able to navigate and find those resources, but with a little bit of sort of you copy pasting into Google Sheets, maybe cleaning up the data set a little bit more, absolutely, those are available. And also from colleges and research institutions often have data sets available. And then a couple other, I don't know if California does a data jam, but there are other science institutions across the country that do their own data jams and also have these sets of data. So there's one in Baltimore, there's one in New Mexico. So I can send some links out about the whole network of data jams as well. Happy to do that.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
India, I have a question about the light in the lake, which specifically studies water quality and algal blooms. Do you have a data set that is really close to that?
We do. We don't have, so algal blooms are a problem everywhere. We don't have a data set that's specifically algal blooms, but we have some really interesting but somewhat more complicated water chemistry, stream chemistry data sets. Let me show you real quick, if I may, Mary Ellen.
Yes, please.
Okay, share my screen. Let's navigate back to the data sets. So a lot of what we do at Carey Institute is monitor streams, because streams are fascinating in so many ways. And so we have incredibly detailed data sets on stream chemistry measured at like hourly rates from these monitoring stations that we've set up. So for instance, salt pollution in a Hudson River tributary is one of those. These data are like, I chose zebra mussels to show because it's like an organism that we can see, we can relate to, and chemistry can be a little bit more opaque. But the data look like this. There's a lot of metadata, a lot of background information. But for instance, we have year and then average amount of salt in kilograms per year. And so this is interesting because you can relate this to, say, trends in road salt usage over the years. This is very much a human impact, but also we can look deeper at the ways in which salt pollution affects organisms and health of the stream. And so maybe we can bring in another data set and see, okay, maybe we can see how abundant was a certain type of fish in the stream in the year 1993, which has a really high salt content. Could that possibly have to do with the salt content of the stream? So we have these little details of the ecosystem that are encapsulated in a study that we can then extrapolate to other ecosystem functions and players. So that's one example of a water chemistry data set. And then we have another one that has even more variables with nitrate levels and such. So does that answer your question, Jewel? More or less? Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, storm impacts on water chemistry. Storms are incredibly impactful for aquatic ecosystems. If you can imagine, a huge influx of new water into a stream will totally disrupt the biological and chemical balance. So that's also something we study. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Great. So my iPad is having some technical difficulties, so I'm just going to show you how to use the website versions of these apps. But please know that you can also go to your app store on a mobile device, or if you have an iPad cart for your classroom, you can get these as apps also. And here we go. Oh, I'm so sorry, it's asking you guys. Great. All right, so the one that we use probably most often at the Artifact is this app called Canva. or you can also go to canva.com. And what you do is, well, first, we would probably go as a teacher. You can get an education package for free, but we're going to do it later. I'm going to just skip all of these intro documents, and I'm going to click on infographic. So just to refresh us, your students would need data before they get to this point, something to work with. But say, for example, that they were doing a project on who likes hot dogs versus hamburgers, just to keep going with the data set that I hypothetically collected from a pretend class before. You can get things, a template that's laid out where you would highlight the text that they have inserted, deleted, and then type in your own. Okay, you would need to zoom in, but then you would need to either create your own graphics, or you would need to use what they call assets. Those are pre-made ones. Where do we go? There we are. Check out all the different templates for infographics that they have.
And if I may emphasize, Mary Ellen, just to cut in, that you'll see that the different infographics are like business, process, education, science. So,
Safety. Yeah.
right, exactly. There's not, yeah, infographics do not only apply to pure science, and any concept that you're trying to explain can be translated through an infographic.
Right, so over here on the left in your toolbar, once you've played around with what kind of different templates you might want to use, you can take and use your own photos. There are also stock photos that you might want to put in there. You can add text, you can add video to your different infographics, and then the clip art, so to speak, is called elements. So going back down to some stickers, if we were doing ice cream versus donuts, a student who's trying to make this in a hurry might click on ice cream and then click on donuts and then add, 7 ice creams versus 3 donuts. You can also add a chart in. You would need to use maybe a different background to be able to make the most of this chart. Sorry, let me go back, and we're going to get rid of the template in the background and then go back to elements and then add a graph. Right, and then you would need to input your data over here. So let's say item 1 would be hot dogs. Okay, let's say that on the first day, 3 people said it, and then on the second day, 10 people said they like hot dogs. Everybody had a change of heart. And then on the next day, we went back to 3. See how over here the table changed correspondingly? And if item 2 is hamburgers, and we had 7 who liked hamburgers. I'm just making data up at this point. Please do not do this, because you would make all of the scientists in the room very sad. But just for the sake of showing you how things work in this program. Here we go. Right, you can get animated GIFs, you can have it make pie charts, you can have it make bar graphs. You can also color in your own gradients. Oh, this is relatively new. They have a whole clip art for coronavirus folder. That might be equal parts cool and sad, actually. What a time we live in, right? Very interesting. Okay, so that is Canva. You would really need to jump in and play around with it, and your students, I am sure, will take to it very, very easily. All right, we also have, and I'm gonna pause share for just a second because I wanna go back and look at everybody else, the other participants, and see, do we have any questions about Canva so far? No? Okay. This one is called Icon Graph. So this is something I've only used on mobile, but they have a website that you can go to get a quick link to download it. It is very similar to what we just showed you in Canva, but it has some different features, like it has a interactive GIF making out of your infographics app. So for example, in Canva previously, it was like they changed it for you. You can highlight different bits and pieces of the visuals that you make in Icon Graph and direct it to animate those for you. How did sorry everybody, bear with me. All right, another infograph making site that is up on my iPad but is not on my computer. It's called easel.ly. This is going to make me create a new account. I'm sorry, everybody.
Wait, is this, I think that was a 3D printing service. It might not have been the same easel that you just found. Easel.ly, you said? There. Haha.
Aha, there we go.
Excellent. I'm glad we didn't just sign up for a 3D printer.
Yes, me too. Although you showed us some pretty cool 3D tables and graphs before, so.
If only we all had a 3D printer. Anyway, back to you.
Anyway, so I'm gonna put the names of these different apps into the chat so that you can play around with them. I apologize that I'm having trouble getting my iPad connected to the shared screen with Zoom, but there are templates for infographics that are downloadable. There is also something to be said for a good old-fashioned hand-drawn graph, at least to start. I am a big fan of, and sorry everybody, I've somehow lost the Brady Bunch view, as we like to call it. Where did everybody go? Right, I guess we can open it up to questions while I am working through these technical difficulties over here. But yeah, Canva, like the word canvas, but without the S on the end, is your infograph maker's best friend. I can also definitely recommend Icon Graph and Easily, not to be confused with Easel, the 3D printer service. There is also an app I've heard a lot about called Anime Maker, which is exclusively for making animated infographics, but I have not had a chance to play around with that yet. So I would say take some time with it before you assign it to students. There's my video panel. All right, sorry everybody. All right, we are at 11:36. Do we have any questions, comments, project ideas? To bring it on back to Light in the Lake, this could be a great opportunity for you to conduct some citizen science of your own. Correct me if I'm wrong, India, I think 4th grade is a little on the young side for Data Jam, but I believe that you can enter starting, is it 5th grade or 6th grade?
So it is technically 6th grade, but we also just introduced a family category for younger students to work on with their families.
Family Jam.
Family Data Jam. And that was supposed to just be a one-time thing to respond to distance learning needs, but people liked it so much that we're going to keep it for next year. So if you have super young students, younger than middle school, who want to work with their parents or with older siblings, Family Data Jam. That's the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, and Data Jam is a lot of fun. I've been on the judging committee for the past 3 or 4 years. We've also had students who have worked in groups to submit projects. It's just really fun and an opportunity, even if you don't officially enter Data Jam, to have students go outside, observe the world around them day by day, take measurements. If they live near a body of water, they could replicate what the 2 young protagonists in The Light in the Lake are doing in their lake. It's also an opportunity to just send kids outside to start asking questions, you know,
About their local environment.
about their local
You know?
environments. There was a group in the city of Poughkeepsie that just did a project on what are the fuzzy things that are eating all of the oak tree leaves. And I don't know if you have seen oak leaves when they fall, sometimes have teeny little burn marks, they almost look like, in them. It turns out that those are specific animals laying eggs. They're called galls, Galls, and they are concentrated in certain pockets throughout Poughkeepsie, but not everywhere in Poughkeepsie. So just a really fun opportunity to take a great book, a great story, and use it as a jumping off point for diving into the world of data literacy and visualization, especially for learners who are maybe not so strong with the textual verbal side of things. Go back to that birthday cake. A birthday cake with 5 candles on it, a 5-year-old can understand that that is meant to represent something other than the cake with candles. So,
India, could I ask you, you showed us a couple of interesting data sets about water quality in streams.
Yeah.
Can you visualize a little bit further down the road in a classroom setting, what kind of an infographic might we see a student develop from a water quality data set?
That is a great question, especially because I think that something like a water quality data set needs an infographic to make it understandable for younger audiences, because, you know, as I was talking about, chemistry data is opaque. We can't see molecules, so we can't picture what NaCl or salt looks like. So what I would think is that choosing one, so especially for younger audiences, choosing one water chemistry factor to graph. I'll take the example of salt over time, for instance, graphing salt levels over time, and then putting this graph into an infographic, and then almost making an annotated graph where you point out outliers on the graph, for instance, and try to explain what was happening during this year that caused the salt levels to spike in such a way. And you can emphasize that point on the graph, add text, add like a text box coming off of it that says, in 1993, we had a record road salt usage. And so that could be sort of your extra information to add to the graph. And then you can include a visual, say, of what road salt looks like. Oh, I've seen that before. I see this every winter, but maybe a young student wouldn't register that, but it's bringing in familiar imagery, bringing in familiar concepts to sort of bolster a graph that otherwise might be hard to interpret. And so that really is the power of an infographic. And the way that I like to conceive of infographics is sort of like annotating the data set. Does that make sense? Right.
And Jewel, here is an example of a template in Canva, the Canva app or canva.com, where this is set up to be about a morning routine. This is meant to represent time, but it could easily represent a river. So if we remember the infograph that Indy showed everybody before, if this is Hudson River and salinity levels, you could even do kind of a staggered series of infographics where very first thing you do is this northernmost point would be Troy, right, as the northernmost point, and then you would put the number of, how do we measure salinity levels? It's parts per million, right? Okay, so that right there would be the parts per million of salinity measured at that point, and then you would put what's next down over here would be Hudson, and then, so you can turn it into a river And then you can not even draw your conclusions yet, but just visualize on paper or in digital space. The northernmost points had this level of salinity parts per million, and then going down the river towards the south, this level of parts per million. That would help someone take a series of numbers in a table and turn it into a visual image. And then you could take a second set of data, for example, kinds of fish, a specific kind of fish. What's the kind of fish that loves salinity? India?
Striped bass?
Yeah.
Maybe striped bass?
The striped bass.
We'll say that.
The
Correct
number
me
of
if I'm wrong.
yeah. I think all fish like some degree of salinity, right? So,
Yeah.
I know, I love it. You could put that over top of your same map, but then you would be able to, kind of like the map of the bedroom with the tracing paper of the chloropleth over it. You could do the same where you look at how different fish levels line up with different points along the river north to south. I would suggest that a teacher have in mind specifically what they want their students to do and suggest some templates before they let them loose in a thing like Canva. Because if you want to get a little more conceptual with it, let's replace the current page with this. At a different point in your scientific method process, if they have already made their different conclusions that this percentage of fish live best in this percentage of salinity, you would then select another template, and that would help illustrate your point as well. So I guess the question is really, are you making an infograph to help clarify your internal understanding of what you're looking at? Are you making an infograph to help clarify the visual results of what you have just been figuring out to report out to people? Are you doing a little bit of both? The answer is probably a little bit of both, depending on where you are. But yeah, looking through all of these different infographics, there are so many uses, and it goes outside of ecology, of course. You could use your infograph for anything from school safety rules to trying to find out what the best times to go fishing are at your local lake, everyone's favorite vacation spots. Yeah, really, anytime there is information, that there's knowledge that you are trying to communicate out, or that your students are trying to communicate out, tying the verbal to the visual helps ensure the most robust and rich picture of the situation that you can get.
I wonder if any of our teachers have questions.
I did just want to draw attention to Meredith's idea. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Meredith? Because that's awesome. It's an awesome classroom application.
Sure. Just because in the lake they're so concentrated on the water that if you tested for whatever, a certain chemical, the salinity, is it acidic, whatever it is, but have the teacher collect the different types of water ahead of time. Bottled water, tap water, and especially if you used it from the school. Tap water from the school, tap water from the fountain. I know at my school we have this weird little creek, get some of that water, or if it had rained, leave a cup out, or, get water from puddles so that they know it's coming from this specific area. Test it, do a lab together so that they see creating the test just like Ty and Addie do on the lake, and then taking it and then using that data that they helped collect to make an infographic to share, just as Ty and Addie are trying to inform people in their community about the lake, about Nebo Lake, that they could then do the same type of thing, saying this is what's going on with the water where we live.
That's such an awesome example. And, to add to that, some water tests are really easy, and I'm almost positive that most of your science departments have some sort of probe to test dissolved solids, conductivity, different features of water, where you literally just stick a probe in a water sample and you get a number. And so these data can be collected rapidly and then graphed rapidly. Or you could do something as simple as turbidity collect a jar of water from these different locations, which one is clearest? You know, what are the different colors or the different shades of the water? And I love the idea of taking water from outside as well, and then maybe even finding a way to map these data if we can get water samples from different locations along a stream. I mean, that's a fascinating study to do. So I think that's a great idea. Thanks, Meredith.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just a thought about that is if you do tap water from inside students' homes, you might stumble upon some data that shows some conclusions you could draw about water quality and different places where students live, just to be aware of what doors you might be opening. That's one of the wonderful things about data, that you can discover these truths and use them to draw conclusions about your world. But also, you know, in urban environments, often water quality is lower than maybe more affluent suburban environments. And if you want to open that door to talk about environmental justice and, you know, writing class inequality, go for it. But just be prepared that if you do tap water samples, something like that might come about. And that's kind of the exciting thing, in my opinion. But exciting might also be potentially dangerous, depending on how far outside of the scope of Light in the Lake you're willing to go. But I mean, they tackle that in Light of the Lake as well. You know, the dairy farmers don't want to stop using their runoff pool systems. Oh, I'm forgetting the word for it, but it's like they have a little pond that sort of absorbs all of the matter.
Like the leach field? What is that?
Yes.
Leach field, right? Yeah.
Yes, there we go. They are wary of doing anything to change it because they're not making a whole lot of money, and federal prices for their products are getting slashed, and they're under a lot of restrictions from the government. And, you know, there's a very realistic clash between values that this young woman has to figure out. How do I negotiate these two aspects of what, you know, my identity encompasses, and how do I help dairy farmers realize that they need the help even if they don't want to pay for the additional infrastructure, because it's not a problem that's going away, and eventually they won't be able to have their dairy farms if the place gets too polluted.
Christine had raised a question.
Yeah, I love all of this, and I can't wait to start planning. I'm trying to combine everything, and Allison and I were texting earlier. I think we're sort of on the same page. But my question is kind of more for Jewel. In the past, we've always done this book in the fall, and I think it was because we would combine that with an author visit. And we've already established that we're not going to be doing a live in-person author visit. This book tends to fit better with our informational unit, and also it looked like the deadline for the data jam was closer to the spring, like in May. So I'm just wondering, and also the other factor is I have a class set of books, and if my students aren't actually in my class, I'm thinking spring we might have a better chance to, you know, all be in person. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about moving the reading of this novel to the spring, if I can make that work with my science teacher and my curriculum and everything like that.
That I certainly understand that. It makes a lot of sense. And that's entirely up to you. Yes, that's fine. I will say that the author, Sarah Baughman, is willing to do live remote. Now, she may be willing to do that in the spring as well. So if you make that decision to do that, to shift it to the springtime, we can approach her for that and see, you know, would she be willing to do that as well? So we're
okay. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to conflict with any other activities or anything like that.
No, that's your call. Yeah.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Who's excited about data? Yeah. You've been a wonderful group to work with. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. We are going to drop our emails in the chat bar, and if you have questions about either the scientific end of things or the artistic expression end of things, let us know. And India, could you drop your email into the chat, please? Also, please note that Jewel has put a survey link into the chat as well. Please take the survey, let us know how you think it went, and stay in touch. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.
And completing the survey will be your proof of attendance that I will then convey to your district for PD credit, if that is a concern of yours. So do make sure that you complete that. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
India and Mary Ellen and everyone. Have a good rest of the summer.
Thanks, everyone.
It was a pleasure. Take care, everybody.